Hi, I'm Jack Reed, and I'm pleased to join you in commemorating the 30th anniversary of the American with Disabilities Act. I commend URI for focusing the 2020 Honors Colloquium on this critical human and civil rights issue. And it is my honor to introduce today's speaker. Dr. David Mann is a senior researcher at Mathematica. He understands one of the remaining challenges for ensuring equality for people with disabilities is employment. At Mathematica, Dr. Mann oversees the Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on Disability Statistics and Demographics. His work helps produce new insights into improving the well-being of people with disabilities. He is a vital voice as we strive to fulfill the promise of the ADA. I join the University of Rhode Island in welcoming him and look forward to hearing from him. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is David Mann, and I will be giving tonight's lecture. The original plan was for me to present to you in person at the university, but that's not possible now due to the pandemic. Instead, I pre-recorded this lecture for you. I do believe that there are silver linings in most things, and for this one, the logistical changes will allow me to attend my son's birthday party in person. My son was born on October 20, but due to the colloquium, I was scheduled to be out of town on his birthday this year. But now I get to present to you and celebrate his birthday in person. I hope all of you are doing well in this new normal, and I wish you all health and safety in the weeks and months ahead. I would also like to thank the University of Rhode Island Honors Colloquium for inviting me to speak to you. I would like to spend a few minutes introducing myself. As I said a minute ago, my name is David Mann. Both my undergraduate and graduate training were in economics. My sophomore advisor told me I was too social to become an economist, but I ignored her advice and pursued economics anyway. That's a true story. I'm an applied labor economist, but sometimes dabble in healthcare topics. For the past 9 years, I've been a researcher and senior researcher at Mathematica, where I studied the employment and benefit receipt of working age adults and transition age youth with disabilities. Mathematica seeks to improve public well-being by generating and applying rigorous evidence to social policy. We work primarily as contractors to the federal government, but also work for states and foundations. I am active in the disability community. For the past 5 years, I've served on the Pennsylvania Rehabilitation Council, which is an advisory board to the Pennsylvania Office of Vocational Rehabilitation. I was recently appointed to the Pennsylvania State Board of Vocational Rehabilitation, which helps oversee the agency. I also have personal experience with disability. In 1997, just before high school, I suffered a spinal cord injury in a diving accident. I have since been diagnosed with quadriplegia and use a motorized wheelchair for mobility. I reside in Yardley, Pennsylvania, which is one of those famous Philadelphia suburbs that you hear so much about during election cycles. Right now, every time I turn my head, I see a political ad or a political yard sign. So a brief disclaimer before I continue. The views that I express today are not going to represent those of Mathematica, any federal agency or foundation that I'm working with currently or have worked with in the past, or the Pennsylvania Office of Vocational Rehabilitation. All views expressed today are my own. I like to start presentations with a picture that captures what I'd like to talk about, kind of in a large, grand sense. While quarantining during the pandemic, I rewatched some of my favorite movies, and one of them is Back to the Future. If you've seen the movie, you may recognize this picture. It's the inside of the DeLorean time machine. And on the center console are the time circuits, which list 3 dates. The first date tells you where you're going, the second date tells you where you are, and the third one tells you where you were. And that's what I'll be doing tonight, taking you from the past into the future with regards to employment policy for people with disabilities. So I'd like to give a summary of my takeaways up front. These are things that hopefully I will convince you of as as the talk goes on, but I want to state these up front so that you can look for them. The first one is that employment is a major policy issue for people with disabilities. Though some people with disabilities can't work, a lot of them can, and there's a lot of benefits to working. but people with disabilities face barriers, and we need to help them overcome those barriers to become employed. Second, broad, limited interventions that have tried to help people with disabilities get back to work have had limited effectiveness, let's say. However, the interventions that we've tested that provide intensive, customized services are the ones that tend to be more effective, and probably are the avenues that future research and policy should pursue. One thing I hope to convince you tonight is that policy should be grounded in evidence. When we make policy decisions about programs, decisions about practices, based on evidence, we end up in a better place. And the final one is that the search for evidence-based policy, evidence-based employment policy for people with disabilities should continue. Even though we know a lot, there is a lot that we don't learn, and there's a lot of progress that we still have to make so that people with disabilities can work if they want to and are able to. So let us talk about the past and some context. So I'd like to start by defining a few terms. The first term is disability, and disability is not always easy to define. Maybe another speaker this semester has talked about different ways that we can capture disability in data. But for tonight, I'd like to put those debates aside and just have a working definition that disability is a health condition or health conditions that adversely affect someone's ability to function. So these are things that are causing functional limitations, and these limitations might interfere with someone's ability to work, among other things. When I say evidence-based policy tonight, I'm talking about policies, programs, and practices that are rooted in evidence, okay? So, and what do I mean by evidence? I mean empirical data collected about program outcomes, okay? So whether it's numeric outcomes or qualitative data, information collected about outcomes to a program or a practice or an intervention. Next, I want to spend a couple minutes talking about causal evidence. Causal evidence is evidence that isolates the direct effects of a program. And this type of evidence can be hard to get. And why can it be hard to get? It's because correlation is not causality. I'll give you an example. If a bunch of individuals volunteer for a return to work program, and at the end of the program, we see a number of them have gone back to work. Well, is it because the program was truly effective, or it was because the people who volunteered for the program were already highly motivated to work? Okay. Causal evidence is going to be able to disentangle those two things. It's going to be able to tell us, did the program itself improve outcomes? Okay. And often the kind of the gold standard for collecting causal evidence is a randomized controlled trial. So this is kind of like a drug trial, or maybe for nowadays like a vaccine trial, in which you have a treatment group and a control group. You randomly assign people to those groups. You give the treatment group the new thing, you give the control group some kind of placebo or the status quo, and then you measure impacts as differences between outcomes in the two groups. Finally, I'd like to quickly define two key target populations: working age adults, 18 or 21 to 64, and transition age youth, which these ages can range, but usually we're talking about individuals aged 16 to 24. These are people that are leaving adolescence and entering adult life in the adult workforce. So employment is important for everyone. Work is the keystone to economic self-sufficiency. It provides income, and whether that income is in the form of a salary or a wage, it's how you pay bills, it's how you pay for food and housing and any other kinds of goods and services that you need, right? So having an income is very important. And not only does work usually give you direct income, but it also gives you kind of indirect income through other benefits, such as health insurance, retirement, and tuition benefits, things like that. And typically, the better the job and the higher the income, the more that they're also going to pay for those other benefits. But working also has non-monetary benefits as well. There is a psychological benefit. People who work tend to feel better about themselves and have a better kind of outlook. There are also social benefits. As you work, you interact with customers and colleagues, and so you're forming social connections. And finally, there is a link between work and health. Now, we really don't know which way the causality goes. Is it that healthy people tend to work, or that work promotes health? That's unclear, but we at least know that there's a correlation between the two, that a positive correlation, that that those who are working tend to be healthier. Okay, and all of this suggests that people with disabilities who can work should be able to have the income and other benefits that come with work, but also the non-monetary benefits, right? So working is a good thing. So the problem is that people with disabilities face barriers to employment, okay? So relative to those without disabilities, people with disabilities are less likely to work, and they earn less when they do work. So this number that I'm showing you comes from the University of New Hampshire. They have a group that produces a lot of disability statistics, and we work with them sometimes. And in September 2020, just under 33% of people with disabilities were participating in the labor force. And that's relative to almost 76% of people without disabilities. And labor force participation is defined as either working or looking for work, I believe within the last month. So there's a lot of people with disabilities who are just not working or even looking for work. So not everyone with a disability can work. That's actually a really important point. We're not trying to force people who are really sick and unable to work. But we have to also recognize that some people with disabilities can work. But there may be caveats. Maybe they're unable to work consistently. Maybe they have, for example, a psychological or psychiatric disability, and that's episodic in nature. And when they have an episode, they need to take a step back from work. Some other people, they may need assistance or accommodations in order to work. Now, there is a social safety net for people with disabilities who can't work, but there's some caveats here as well. The benefits are meager relative to work income and benefits. So you're going to get more income on average, and you're going to get more benefits on average if you're actually working as opposed to receiving government supports. Second, these supports represent a substantial cost to taxpayers. And Alex should be talking about that more later in the talk. And third, which is really critical, is that people with disabilities want to work. They don't want to sit home receiving benefits if they don't have to. So the disability rights movement has done much to promote employment. So the movement dates back to the 1960s. There's been several major legislative achievements. For example, the Rehabilitation Act in the early 1970s and the Americans with Disabilities Act. And we are celebrating the 30th anniversary this year of the ADA. So that dates back to 1990. So there are also work-related programs that we've seen come out of the work from the disability rights movement. There's vocational rehabilitation. Now, vocational rehabilitation, believe it or not, actually dates back to just after World War I. And it was helping veterans with disabilities get back to work. So we're actually celebrating the 100th anniversary of vocational rehabilitation. However, vocational rehabilitation, as we know it today in the United States, it really started to take shape under the Rehab Act. Also, another program that is out there that helps certain people with disabilities get back to work is the Ticket to Work program. Ticket has been around for just over about 20 years, just under 20 years, and that was authorized by the Ticket to Work Act, I believe, in 1999. So the disability rights movement has many achievements, many more achievements just in employment, but many more achievements more broadly. So that's not the subject of my talk tonight, and I would encourage you, if you're really interested in kind of the history of the disability rights movement and its achievements, to look at that, look into that on your own time. Despite the achievements of the disability rights movement, there's still a need to find strategies to promote employment among people with disabilities. And you saw that from the slide, from a couple slides ago, that there are these large gaps still between things like labor force participation between people with and without disabilities. So there are all different types of ideas and interventions to get people with disabilities to work. And here's some examples. There could be additional training or education that you could provide. You could provide workplace accommodations or ongoing supports that keep going as someone continues to work. You could, those who have unmet medical needs, maybe medical treatment will help them overcome some barriers to employment, adaptive equipment, or even financial incentives where you allow people to hold on to more of their benefits while they work and earn income. Now, each of these ideas, it may not work, or it could work well for some, but not others. The bottom line is that we don't know what's effective without evidence, okay? We need to generate evidence to see whether something works. So evidence can help identify effective policy. Really, at a high level, there's really two ways you can do this. You can roll out programs without knowing whether they work, or you could test programs on a smaller scale and generate evidence about their impacts. Now, this latter method does take some time, but it also has some advantages. You can learn if a program is effective, and if so, how, and by how, I mean, you may learn what kind of outcomes it can and can't influence. Maybe there's a program that's good at helping with improving education outcomes, but it is not helpful with improving employment. So if you test a program, you can learn these types of things. It also allows you to avoid policy mistakes. So putting out programs that could potentially be expensive or not going to achieve what you want them to achieve. Testing can also generate new directions for policy. So if you have a good idea and you test it and it shows to be promising, well, you can build on that and maybe even build a better idea off of the first one. So I don't know if there's an official start to this, but in my mind, it's the 1980s that really marked the beginning of testing, generating evidence for employment programs for people with disabilities. The Social Security Administration tested two programs, and I list them on the slide, for youth with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Okay, and both of these, they used a randomized controlled trial, an RCT, to measure impacts. So again, going after rigorous kind of causal impact estimates. So what is the takeaway from the past? The takeaway is that employment is a major policy issue for people with disabilities. Getting people with disabilities to work benefits them in many ways, monetarily, non-monetarily, and it also lowers government expenditures for their support. People with disabilities, some of them can work, but they face barriers and they need help to overcome those barriers. Employment programs and policies do exist today, things like vocational rehabilitation and various other things. But as I showed you, that employment gap persists. So that means we need new ideas and programs to promote employment. And when we develop these new ideas and programs, we're going to have to test them. We're going to have to generate evidence to see if they work. Okay, moving on to the present. And by present, I really mean more like the recent past. So the Social Security Administration completed several major demonstrations over the last 15, 20 years. And there are non-Social Security Administration demonstrations, but the Social Security Administration demonstrations provide a nice overview of the policy progression. And so since our time is limited, I'm going to really focus on them, but I just want to make that caveat that there's other demonstrations testing other ideas as well. So the Social Security Administration, you might think, why are they testing employment interventions for people with disabilities? Well, they're interested in this topic because they oversee SSI and SSDI. And your next question should hopefully be, what are SSI and SSDI? Well, SSI and SSDI are the premier income support programs for people with disabilities in the United States. The Social Security, SSDI stands for Social Security Disability Insurance. This program provides cash benefits to working age adults unable to work due to disability. This program is funded by payroll taxes, which are also known as FICA taxes. So you might think to yourself, well, I've never paid into SSDI. Well, if you've ever paid FICA taxes, you actually had paid into SSDI. So your FICA taxes, among other things, pay for your two components of Social Security, your DI component, and also your OASI, which is Old Age and Survivors Insurance Benefit. The OASI is kind of what people usually think about when they think about Social Security, the benefits that you receive when you turn a certain age. But your DI benefits are also coming out of FICA taxes. So SSDI only pays benefits to those vested in the program. So you need to be paying into the program for a certain amount over a certain amount of months, or actually years, to be vested in the program. So if you are not vested in the program, you cannot apply for SSDI benefits. Also, SSDI beneficiaries become eligible for Medicare after 24 months of receiving SSDI benefits. SSI stands for Supplemental Security Income. This program supports children, working age adults, and senior citizens. It provides cash payments to children and working age adults with disabilities. You must have limited income and assets to receive benefits from this program. This is not an insurance program like SSDI is an insurance program. So SSDI monies are paid into a trust fund and benefits are paid out of the trust fund. This comes from general annual government spending. Most recipients for SSI are also Medicaid eligible, though that's not always a sure thing. There are some states where those two things are not linked, but this Medicaid eligibility comes instantaneously, usually not, you don't have to wait 24 months. Both programs use the same definitions of disability. The adult definition, paraphrased, is having a medically determinable condition that's going to last at least 12 consecutive months or is expected to end in death, that makes you unable to engage in substantial gainful activity. And substantial gainful activity is actually an amount that is defined by the Social Security Administration. And the other thing to point out is that both of these programs have return to work incentives. They are different between the programs. The SSI incentives are complex. The SSDI incentives are extremely complex. In fact, I think I need a whole separate lecture to help you understand them. So I'm not going to go into that much detail. I think I'm trying to give you the basics on what I think you need for our time together. It is important to understand, though, that SSDI and SSI are big programs. So SSDI has 9.8 million beneficiaries, and it pays an average monthly benefit of just over $1,100. So we're talking about $11 billion in total benefits paid per month. And if you annualize that, that's $132 billion. And again, this is just the cash payment. I am not talking at all about the Medicare costs, which are also substantial. SSI for children, you're talking about 1.1 million recipients, an average monthly payment just under $700. And we're talking about an annualized payment of 9.6, just under 10 billion. Working age adults, you're talking 4.6 million recipients. The average monthly payment is just over $600. So this kind of goes back to that point I was making about how typically when a person with disability works, they receive a higher income. You know, I don't know about you, but $600 a month would probably be difficult to survive on. So working age adults, about 3 billion in total payments per month, or about $36 billion annualized. So if you add up the disability expenditures between SSI and SSDI, just cash payments, you're talking about between 170 and 180 billion dollars each year. That is a large amount of money, even for the US federal budget. So these programs are a significant allocation of resources. And then for SSI, of course, there's also the Medicaid costs, which are also quite substantial. So both of these programs face their unique own challenges. SSDI, the trust fund from which the benefits is paid, has had solvency issues, most recently in the mid-2010s. And actually what they did is they briefly reallocated some of the funds that would typically go to the OASI trust fund. They temporarily allocated more of those to the DI trust fund to shore up the DI trust fund, okay? So that cuts into the amount of monies in the OASI trust fund, but they needed to do this to shore up the fund before it was actually depleted. So there are these solvency issues with the program. And then even with work incentives, it's important to note that very few people exit the program due to work. In fact, I have a colleague who followed a cohort of SSDI beneficiaries, and after 10 years, only 2.7 of them had left the program due to work and remained off the program 10 years out. SSI, there's a strong focus on child recipients and improving outcomes for them. At age 18, the child recipients are reevaluated, their eligibility is under the adult criteria. This is called the age 18 redetermination. Child recipients who do not transition well into the adult workforce, the evidence shows, will likely need ongoing supports, probably a lifetime of income and other supports. And they're also at risk for other poor outcomes. Okay, now on to the SSA demonstrations that it recently completed. So I'm going to focus on 3 that target specific subpopulations, and then I'm going to talk about another 2 which had a broader focus. So this is not an exhaustive list of demonstrations. Again, our time is limited. I'm just trying to give you a sense of the overall story. So I'm using these ones because I think they illustrate them well. It's also worth noting that these are taxpayer-funded demonstrations. And so the reports for these, the description, these are all available on the Social Security Administration website. So if you go on there, you can learn everything that you would want to know about these demonstrations, okay? There was a lot of time and a lot of resources and a lot of thought into develop and testing these ideas. So accelerated benefits. Accelerated benefits was in the field between 2007 and 2009, and it targeted SSDI beneficiaries who did not have health insurance. So they were new beneficiaries. They were not close to the 24-month point at which they would become Medicare eligible. And they didn't have health insurance from any other source. They didn't have, for example, private health insurance coverage from a spouse. So these were truly uninsured people. This was a randomized controlled trial with just under 2,000 volunteer participants. The intervention provided health insurance coverage to everyone in the treatment group. And there was a subset of the treatment group that received employment supports, and they called this group the AB plus group. The employment supports themselves were phone-based, and they were really not that intensive. They did not go beyond these phone supports. The key findings of accelerated benefits, perhaps very unsurprisingly, when you give people who do not have health insurance but have disabilities, you give them health insurance coverage, they use that coverage to address unmet health needs. And then the other key finding, which I think is most relevant to us in our discussion tonight, is that the AB Plus encouraged people to look for work, but the people didn't end up working more, okay? And really, what we want to see is we want to see improvements in employment, we want to see increases in earnings, we want to see substantive increases in earnings. Okay, now on to the mental health treatment study. And this was in the field 2006 to 2010. And this targeted SSDI beneficiaries with schizophrenia or affective disorder as their primary impairment or primary disability. This was also another randomized controlled trial with just over 2,200 volunteer participants. The intervention included supported employment services, and it also provided medication management that allowed these individuals to help keep their condition in a state that they're more likely to work. That was the thinking. So the key impacts were actually an increase in the percentage employed, and that's a really big development. A lot of demonstrations and interventions usually do not have effects, but the mental health treatment study did increase the percentage employed. So this was very good news. However, there's a big caveat to that, and that the earnings did not increase substantively. So one of the things that the Social Security Administration is really interested in seeing is it wants people to increase their employment, increase their earnings enough so that they're no longer dependent on SSI or SSDI for benefits. Okay, you have to have earnings over certain thresholds for certain periods of time to be able to begin to phase out of the SSDI program. And though people were working more, they weren't working and earning enough that they were leaving the program. Now on to the youth transition demonstration. This had various sites, but the sites that we're going to be talking about were in operation from 2003 to 2008. YTD targeted youth 14 to 25 who were receiving or at risk of receiving SSI or SSDI benefits. There were 6 sites that used a randomized design, and there were just about less than 900 youth in each of these sites. The intervention varied across sites, but the things that were consistent is that these interventions were intensive. There were frequent interactions over a sustained period. There were a comprehensive set of services that were also often customized to address the specific barriers that each youth was facing. The key findings, well, impacts varied by site, just as the intervention components and target populations did, but a few of these sites had some positive employment and earnings impact. So this was very, very encouraging to see these types of outcomes among these youth. Now on to the Benefit Offset National Demonstration, or BOND. This was actually one of the first projects that I worked on after I graduated from graduate school and started working at Mathematica. This was in the field 2011 to 2017, and it targeted all SSDI beneficiaries. And this was a randomized controlled trial with 2 stages. And I want to pause here for a minute and talk about why this is important. So all the demonstrations that I've talked about to this point, they use volunteers, okay? And I guess there's nothing wrong with that, but volunteers, going back to an example that I gave much earlier, volunteers may be more likely to work because these people are volunteering for employment interventions, right? So it's reasonable to think that relative to the overall population, the volunteers are much more interested in working. And the volunteer rates that most of these demonstrations get, it hovers around like 5 to 10%. So it's very hard to think that they represent the entire target population. They probably represent a small subset that's more motivated to work. Now Bond had a volunteer stage, but it also had a very large non-volunteer stage. Stage 1, which is a stage that I was mostly involved in evaluating, they randomly assigned 80,000 people into treatment and 80,000 people into control. And then they actually had a supplemental control group. So the actual stage 1 sample, if you included all the control individuals, was like over 900,000. You just don't hear about demonstrations with that large of a sample. The larger the sample, the smaller the impact that we can detect. So with Bond, we were going to be able to detect really small impacts if they existed. The intervention included annualized earnings reporting, which is different. You have to report your earnings to Social Security Administration on a monthly basis if you have them, but they went to an annual earnings reporting model. And then what they also did is, for those with substantive earnings, instead of having them lose all of their benefits when they worked over a certain threshold, they replaced that with a benefit offset that enabled people to lose $1 in benefits for every $2 in earnings that they had. So the key findings, there were no substantive earnings or employment impacts, and bond actually increased benefits paid. So on net, the Social Security Administration was paying more in benefits to individuals who were in the treatment group than who were in the control group and receiving kind of status quo benefits and work incentives. Finally, ticket to work. And I'll admit here that I am cheating a little bit. Ticket to work is not a demonstration. It was actually rolled out in 2002 to 2004, and it's actually an active program. It gives SSI and SSDI beneficiaries a ticket that they can assign in exchange for free employment supports from their state vocational rehabilitation agency or a private employer network. So the provider is only paid if the beneficiary achieves certain milestones or outcomes. Assigning a ticket is voluntary, so it's completely optional. Ticket was not pilot tested, so they just kind of developed the program and rolled it out. And there were difficulties with program rollout. In fact, they had to change some of the rules in the first years to try and get employer networks more involved. There have been no substantive employment or earnings impacts from ticket, and there's been a number of evaluations that have looked at this and looked at it from different angles, and all of them kind of come up with the same conclusion that you don't see employment or earnings impacts. In fact, the ticket assignment rate, the actual percentage of beneficiaries who assign their ticket is quite low. So what are the takeaways from the present? The first one, I think, is that broad, limited interventions have been less effective. These less effective interventions, they targeted broad populations like all SSDI beneficiaries. Some of them altered complex work incentive rules, and others just provided limited assistance. Like with AB, you see the phone intervention. One note about altering complex work incentive rules. If you're taking a set of work incentive rules that are already terribly complex and are not understood that well by most beneficiaries, and you tweak them, it's probably reasonable to think that the tweaked version is probably not going to be well understood either. So, and people are not going to be able to respond well if they don't understand the work incentives that have been placed in front of them. These programs did not have impacts even among volunteer participants, and we talked about why that's important a few minutes ago. And this ultimately suggests that demonstrations in the future should be testing different ideas. Second takeaway is that intensive, long duration interventions might be effective. So what was showing promise? Things that provided comprehensive support services for a sustained period. So think about mental health treatment study, or think about YTD. These demonstrations were also focusing on specific populations, right? So they're taking tailored interventions that are supposed to really be very impactful for certain groups of beneficiaries, not necessarily all, but certain groups. And so the natural takeaway here, I think, is that future demonstrations should try and expand on these ideas. Third takeaway is that we should ground policy decisions in evidence. All the interventions that were tested were initially thought to be promising. If they weren't, we would not have invested all the time and resources and effort into seeing whether they work, okay? So several of them were not effective, and in those cases, generating evidence really helped avoiding bad policy, or maybe or more expensive policy, or policy that really was just not achieving the objectives that you wanted, okay? And so the takeaway is that through demonstrations, we can identify what works and also what doesn't, and that's really important. So let us talk about the future. Ongoing demonstrations are working to generate new evidence, and there's a lot of them out there. Again, I'm just going to pick a subset to talk to you about tonight, and here are the four of them. All of these four are going to rely on volunteers, or are relying on volunteers. As I said, there are other demonstrations. This is just a subset. So the first one that I want to talk about are the work-based learning transition demonstrations. These are in the field, or these grants, I should say, are in effect from 2017 to 2021. And what's the big idea here? The big idea is to take high school age youth and provide them with transition supports and services with an emphasis on work-based learning experiences. So obviously the target population is transition age youth with disabilities. 5 state grants were given to the vocational rehabilitation agencies in those states. 2 of the grants are being evaluated by a randomized controlled trial. Mathematica is involved in both of those, and I am heading up the evaluation component in the state of Maryland. The final impact reports are due in late 2021. So this is something that's something that I'm working on now, and spend my days gathering data, developing analysis plans, and working on trying to determine whether this program, at least the one that I'm looking at, had impacts. So this is funded by the Rehabilitation Services Administration and the Department of Education. And the reason that they're involved is because the Rehabilitation Services Administration oversees vocational rehabilitation at the federal level. So moving on to promoting readiness of minors in SSI, also known as PROMISE. So this was actually in the field 2014 to 2019. So it actually is kind of completed, at least the field component. And the big idea is to build on the success of YTD and provide supports and services to child SSI recipients to help them transition successfully into adult life. The target population, transition age youth with disabilities on SSI. There were 6 programs across the country, and they used a randomized controlled trial to evaluate short-term impacts. There actually are short-term impacts already reported for this demonstration, and they actually showed positive impacts on employment and some other outcomes. Now, the final impact results are due just over a year from now in 2022. And this is a project that's not only funded by SSA, but with other partner agencies. On to promoting opportunity demonstration, or POD. This is 2018 to 2021 is when it's in the field. And the big idea here is, let's take the benefit offset that was debuted in bond, but let's use a different earnings cutoff. So that means basically letting this benefit offset start at a different point. And let's further simplify those work incentives so that maybe they'll become easier to understand for beneficiaries. Like bond, we're targeting all SSDI beneficiaries here. This is a randomized controlled trial, 8 sites across the country. Final impact results are due in 2021. So another demonstration that's where we're going to be learning a lot more next year about final impacts. I'm also involved on POD as well, and this is funded by the Social Security Administration. Finally, let us talk about retaining employment after injury illness network. Okay, this is probably the newest of all of the ones that I'm talking about. This is going to extend into the mid-2020s. And what's the big idea here? This is to intervene early to help people with disabilities stay in or quickly re-enter the labor force. And I want to pause here because I think that this is a really novel idea, and we're really excited about it, or at least just to see whether it works, right? We don't know if it works, that's why we're testing it. But the reason that it's appealing is that when you look at someone who's on SSDI benefits already, so they need to not have worked for 5 months in order to apply. When you apply, it usually takes, the times vary, but usually I think it's around 100 to 150 days to get an initial decision. Again, that number jumps around, but I think it's somewhere in that range usually. And if your initial application is denied and you go to appeal it, which happens frequently, and you need to get a hearing before an administrative law judge, your decision, it could take years, literally years to get a decision. So you have someone who is on SSDI benefits, maybe they haven't been working for months. It could be that they haven't been working for years and they had to fight an appeal to get their benefits. And now you're asking them through various programs to say, hey, do you want to go back to work? When they've just spent a lot of time trying to demonstrate that they can't work. The idea of retain, though, is let's intervene early. Let's go to someone right when they have a disability onset, or when their disability just becomes, the barriers associated with their disability just become strong enough that they're unable to work, okay? And to intervene at that point and to provide them at that point with services and supports that allow them to remain in the labor force or to quickly re-enter it, okay? So that's the big idea. The target population is those at risk for SSI or SSDI. There's a randomized controlled trial with 8 sites across the country. Final impact reports, again, we're gonna have to wait a while, 2025. And this is funded by the Social Security Administration, but also the Department of Labor. So what's the takeaway for the future? The takeaway is that the search for evidence-based policy continues. Some demonstrations are building on past successes. Others are testing some brand new ideas, and there's a broad range of interventions here. So I think it's a kind of exciting time because we're testing kind of new ideas, some really brand new, a number of them also though based on evidence of effectiveness that we've had in the past. So my hope is that we'll be learning that we'll see that a number of these are effective and will eventually be adopted into broader policy. So one more thing I'd like to highlight before I end my time with you tonight, and that's the role of evidence for advocates. So advocates have a lot to celebrate, and we talked about that earlier in the presentation about all the things that they've done for the disability community. And even this year, we've got 2 key milestones to celebrate: vocational rehabilitation turning 100, and the Americans with Disabilities Act turning 30. But despite this progress, as I've shown you and we've talked about, people with disabilities are much less likely to work than their non-disabled peers, and they often require income and program support. And I really feel that in order to advance disability rights further, we need to make more progress on this topic. So I firmly believe that disability rights could advance more quickly if advocates learn to embrace evidence on a deeper level. Advocates should be cautious about endorsing practices that are not grounded in evidence. Just because a program's been around a while, if there's no evidence that it's been effective, we need to think about whether or not we should be advancing that practice or program as something that's really helping people with disabilities. Maybe there's a better alternative out there. And that we should also endorse practices where there's evidence of effectiveness. So if we have rigorously tested something and we see that it improves employment or improves earnings, I think that the advocacy community should really be championing those types of policies because they can help people with disabilities more. If a new practice emerges, then we should take the time and expend the effort to test it, to really see if it works. And we should be prepared to not only embrace it if it is effective, but we should also be prepared to try something else if a practice is not effective. Okay, so, and I think that by identifying and advancing effective practices, that should ultimately speed the progress in disability rights because it's going to end up with more people with disabilities employed. So to the advocates out there tonight, please consider using evidence when you advocate. Use it on background, but also use it when you're advocating for what programs, policies should be out there that policymakers should be embracing. It's also, though, important to say that the reverse needs to be true as well. Researchers like me need advocates to inform program development and testing. If researchers and advocates are out of sync, policy will move forward, but I think it will move forward more slowly. because we're struggling, because we really don't know what works. We know what goals we have, but we don't know the best ways to get there. Now, I think that researchers have historically not done a good job reaching out to advocates. And I think that's often because they feel that if they do, and they develop these relationships, that they're not going to be able to remain objective. And I think that that is not a correct understanding of what would happen if they reached out. I think it is possible for researchers to work with advocates and remain objective. In my personal experience as a researcher, and I also, because of my involvement in the disability community and my disability, I frequently interact with people who are advocates for people with disabilities. And in some ways, I'm an advocate in that I strongly believe that people with disabilities need to work and should have the supports and services to do so. And I feel like I've been able to maintain my objectivity by, when we have discussions as advocates and talk about advancing policy, I try and draw attention to policies that are evidence-based, and for all the reasons that I've talked about. I really think that if we can merge these two together, evidence and advocacy, we can really get a lot done. So this is my last slide for the presentation. I want to let you know how you can contact me or follow me on social media. So my work email address is on the slide. On Twitter, you can follow me at David R. Mann. I tweet on disability news, policy, research. I do not tweet on politics, which makes me in the minority right now, I think, on Twitter. But if you're really interested in these topics and want to follow what I'm following, I invite you to follow me on Twitter. My Mathematica staff page, that is a link to it. You will see a really bad picture of me, but you will also see links to a lot of my work. So if you're interested in the studies that I've done in the past 9 years, whether it be 6 months ago or 8.5 years ago, there are links to those things, to most of those things on the staff page. And also there's a story about my, how I came to Mathematica and my disability, also on Mathematica's website, and I provide a link to that as well. So I want to thank you again for the opportunity to present to you tonight, and I hope that all of you have a great evening.